Hello and welcome to NIGP's Learning Lab. Today's session is Learn from the Stars, hosted by Richard Pennington with special guest Ed Haynes. Richard has over 35 years of experience in public procurement law and leadership in the U.S. Air Force and state government, 7 years of which was in private law practice. He helps in development and facilitation of NIGP's Pathways courses. Richard is a co-author of the third edition of Legal Aspects of Public Procurement and the author of Seeing Excellence, Learning from Great Procurement Teams.
I would, thank you. Welcome everybody to Creating Excellence, Learn from the Stars. Let me just tell you where this kind of came from. Some time ago, several years ago, I was visiting the city of Thornton, and I had learned about the NIGP OA4 accreditation, which stands for the Outstanding Agency Achievement Award. And I wanted to find out more about it, and I had made an appointment with Susan White, who was the purchasing manager in the city of Thornton, just north of Denver, which is where I'm at. And I showed up a little early, and I went to the waiting area, and I was impressed because there were nice chairs, not just for purchasing, but for the whole organization, for people to actually sit as they waited for people to arrive. This was post-2001, of course, and so there was some security concern, I know, in Thornton, but what they had done is had some nice waiting areas outside of the various offices. I was greeted by a couple people who asked who I was and who I was there to see. Very nice. And I noticed on the wall that there was a vision statement and a mission statement. And what impressed me was I just felt well taken care of. And the reason I had gone there was the city of Thornton had been one of the few public entities who had maintained continuous OA for accreditation by NIGP since its inception. And I wanted to find out more about it. So that's where this came from, the idea that as part of a team, you often are going to try to find good examples of things that you can emulate that help you improve your operations. And I broadly call them stars, and we'll kind of see why we've done that. The one thing I never did was, in the book, I never defined what excellence was. And it occurred to me, a few years ago, that in many respects, NIGP and at the sister organization, the National Procurement Institute, the ISM sort of parallel, they both have accreditations. And it occurred to me that, if we look at what they've done, we can easily see really what the elements of excellence are. And I'm going to kind of show you that today. And I think right now, that's probably where I am on this, is if you're trying to define what excellence is, take a look at those. So that'd be the through line here in terms of the presentation. Some of you were in my very first one of these learning labs, and you'll remember that we had done a continuous improvement initiative back in the state of Colorado when I was director there, and used visual metaphors as ways to kind of remember placeholders for what ultimately became the 10 disciplines, the 10 team disciplines. On our first learning lab in August, we talked about purpose and the importance of understanding and keeping purpose in mind for almost anything a team does, whether it's decisions, finding members, figuring out how to do analysis, what you want to measure, how you're going to do project management, those types of team disciplines. And one of those is this one that we're doing today on looking at best practices and what you can learn from other organizations. I use the telescope metaphor because it goes good with the stars, and it's a way to look out in the distance and often well outside your own geographical area and see what people are doing and what kind of cool things they're doing. But I'm going to just ask a question, and I'll probably get you all to smile privately on this, and that is, have you ever looked through the other end of the telescope? Now, I know that there used to be toy stores, and I remember going in and I'd look around and make sure nobody would see me do this, but I knew how to look through the small end the way a telescope's supposed to be used, but every now and then I would kind of wonder how it looks through the other side. So the second half of what we're going to do today is going to be looking at systems and a different way, sort of looking at things in a different way. I call that looking through the wrong end of the telescope. It kind of reminds me of the importance of what we call systems thinking. And you're all part of one, and we're going to see kind of how that works today. So look through the telescope. And when we get to the end of this, what I'm hoping you'll be able to do is satisfy, or that we will satisfy, these objectives. You're going to see how procurement associations, awards, and accreditations programs help you identify best practices. You're going to actually come up with some questions to assess the utility of other organizations' best practices, how they're relevant to you. We're going to see the importance of internal benchmarking kind of as a first step, and critically evaluate and practice that once external benchmarks for how they are applicable to your operation in trying to get better. So that's what we're hoping to do today. I'm fortunate to have a star, one of the stars from that I identified after the book, actually, but Ed Haynes really represents this very well. He's the Vice President of Procurement at HCA, the Hillsborough County Aviation Authority. You all better know that as Tampa International Airport. And you can see on his bio summary here, he's found excellence. He's found excellence through FAPO, the Florida Association of Public Procurement, and their accreditation, or their award for procurement excellence. He's found it in the National Procurement Institute, the Achievement of Excellence in Procurement Award, that many of you may have seen announcements here on social media within the last week. They've announced this year's winners of the award for by the National Procurement Institute. His group also got the NIGP Outstanding Agency Accreditation Achievement Award, the OA4, that's the precursor of the current accreditation now, the Quality Procurement, Public Procurement Department Award, that is very similar, and we'll look at that in a little bit. And then finally, I call this the penultimate achievement. Ed's organization achieved what NIGP has named the Pareto Award, and we'll explain a little bit about how that is different from the other accreditations, and you'll hear from Ed on that. So welcome, Ed, to this, and I look forward to your insights on this. We probably ought to just start a little bit with an understanding of what some of the terms are, like a benchmark. You know, a benchmark, if you look on Google, on the internet, is actually a surveying term. It represented once there's been a fixed point in space on the Earth. It's a place that people can go to and be assured that what they are anchoring from and measuring from represents consistently the point at which they're making a lot of measurements. I know in Colorado we have one of these on the Colorado General Assembly, our state capitol. It's on one of the steps, and it's the Mile High benchmark. So there's actually a plaque, or a bronze device that looks similar to this one that's on the page, that shows where they're measuring altitude from and how we kind of got the name. This one happens to be in the Four Corners area where Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico all meet. That's a benchmark. So that term has been used to describe a point in time from which, or a place, or a measurement from which you can compare. And that's been used widely now in business. NIGP has a couple of these. The most recent one you may have seen is the 2020 benchmarks on salaries and compensation. That was done this year. Last year, they did a public paper that is on their site, and we're going to see a short extract of that here in just a minute, that represents in our profession, some measurements that NIGP has published that are benchmarks as well. So here's the definition. If you're not used to using the NIGP dictionary of terms, I suggest you really get familiar with it. It's got some great definitions, among them this one. Benchmarking is an act of measuring a process, service, or product against leaders, their measurements in an area that you choose to review. And it's a study, a review, or a process. And we're going to kind of look at that a little bit more detail here in just a minute, whereby a procurement department sort of looks at world-class entities, good practices that they can emulate and try to improve. That is the definition of benchmarking that really builds off the idea of the benchmark. The best practice is closely related, and we'll return to this here in a little bit, but that's an actual process or an operation that your peers typically are going to consider outstanding or exceptional, or really what you try to strive for. I know yesterday I was on a call with Lisa Frank from NIGP on a best practice that soon will be out on stakeholder relationships. And the idea on this is to come up with a consensus idea of what the standard might look like that you're trying to achieve in terms of how you reach out and how you engage stakeholders. So they are considered sort of a leading edge activity. And the ultimate objective, if you see the words here, efficiency and effectiveness, is kind of what we as procurement organizations, or organizations in general, are trying to achieve through continuous improvement programs, what they do in strategic planning. Really, that's the goal, is to try to improve and have world-class, as Ed has shown, efficiency and effective in terms of the best practices and what they're achieving. What we try to do is we're trying to improve productivity and the quality and reduce the costs, and probably most important, increase the service to the customer. This chart is from the NIGP 2019 cycle time summary. And I picked out the parts that had to do primarily with cycle time on sourcing events or the sourcing approaches. You've got the sole source, which not surprisingly has an average time of much less than things like RFPs that are partly down here. They also distinguish between non-IT and IT, which according to this, and probably my experience, maybe yours, tend to have different averages because they're often different in complexity. So this has sole sources, small purchases, the cycle time, probably, we're not sure exactly, but probably from when the requisition may be submitted, the requirements defined up to some point in time. Can't really tell from this, but it could be related, for example, to the contract execution or the award decision on a competitive solicitation. And the ones I'd like you to look at are RFPs, and that's about halfway down. And you'll see that on the request for proposals, the chart here got a feedback or inputs from, it appears as though the N is the 81 people in non-IT and 73 inputs from IT, that the average, probably not surprisingly, was 74 for non-IT, which was less than the IT, which is higher complexity, that was 90. And the median, which is different than the average, the median is the point at which half of the responses were below and half of the responses were above. And as you can see, the median here was 60 for the non-IT, and the IT was 70. This shows what the elements are normally of a formal kind of external benchmarking process. You try to find organizations that may have the best practices. In this case, we're using an aggregated series of data for cycle times. Often on a formal one, you'll actually go directly to some of the organizations you consider best in class. We're looking more like from an average perspective. You do consider differences in organizational context about how things may be different. You may actually have to go visit and talk to people about it. Then you compare to what maybe you have to what you determine is the number for a best-in-class organization. You try to find the gaps, and then you try to find why it is maybe you're not achieving those gaps. But as you'll probably know already, when you look at another organization, like procurement cycle times, there may be differences, and there may be reasons why it's not as relevant to you and what you're trying to look at in terms of approval processes. What I'm going to ask you to do is to go back in and brainstorm answers to this questions. First of all, have you ever done this before? And second, even if you haven't, what are the reasons that the relevance of those numbers, those RFP numbers? I think one was 77, and the other was 90 in the non-IT and the IT cycle times, probably from requisition up to contract award. But what are the reasons those might be limited? And probably most important is brainstorm in your small little breakout group questions you'd want to ask. In this case, you'd be asking NIGP since they did the study, but if you could identify some of the ones or a organization that you were really trying to emulate because they were doing well, for example, Tampa International Airport would be one that I'd probably want to go to, especially if I was in the aviation space or the airport space. What are the questions you want to ask? So, and this is what the group 2 did to look at critically kind of look at those numbers. And great questions. When does it start? Kathleen, what about the document development protest period? What was that about?
Well, in our RFP process, we include the document development, and then the protest period is built into it because it occurs after the end of the evaluations and prior to board award. So we anticipate or schedule at least 180 days for our RFPs, totally, starting with document development to board award.
So why would somebody that was coming to you and benchmarking and talking to you, why would that be important for them to understand in terms of the cycle time numbers that you track?
Well, it's the resources that the procurement department and the requesting department is allocating to this RFP. Okay.
And Tina's having a few challenges on this. Jump right in, Tina, if you can. I think you're on mute now on phone, but she asked really, I think, one of the critical questions, and that is, now, are you measuring from advertisement to contract award? That's a great question in terms of that. And I know that Majed, who's from Long Beach Transit, I think Tina's from Concord, New Hampshire. Majed is a senior buyer at Long Beach. He asked, does this include the closeout period? So Majed, help me with that. Yeah, what was on your mind on that, on the closeout period?
Right. So, I mean, it makes sense, the fact that, we have to track the time of us being involved in the RFP and solicitation, but, we have the closeout period where after the award, we have to, at least we do, we double check every invoice, at least especially the first invoice, right? And we follow up and confirm that the contractor is doing what they're supposed to do. So this is really, we're not as involved as we are in the pre-phases and in the solicitation phases, but we are still involved in the closeout.
Okay.
So do we want to
somebody
count that?
Somebody that was looking at your numbers then, I mean, you're pulling in a portion of contract administration to your numbers then when you track stuff. They would have to know that.
Correct.
Go ahead.
One of the things Group 1 did talk about was the differences between agencies and for example, their governing body, how often do they meet? And if they meet twice a month, for example, we have DOCCs meet every week and cities every other week. That's great. Whereas at the Aviation Authority, our board meets once a month, but they only meet 10 months out of the year. So that could be a big difference in timing of getting something awarded.
Yeah. You know, and in the state, we actually, when I was with the state, we didn't have a governing board, so everything was delegated down to an officer or an official. So we didn't have the built-in wait times for those things. That's a great insight.
And they also talked about the development period. Is that considered part of the process, or is it not? So, and that can significantly change your durations.
Yeah. So the purpose of this, I hope you understand, is just to be critical. If you start looking at numbers like that, there are a lot of questions that you need to ask. I mean, I'm going to now let you see the rest of the story here on the 2019 RFP cycle time. Another chart. This is also in the NIGP, and notice things are clumped. The 90 days on the IT side, there's a bunch of responses there that came in at 90. On the 180, there's a bunch of responses. And when I looked at this, what this told me is some people are just guessing. That they're kind of saying, we think we're about a 90-day average, you know, whatever, however to define that. So that's something you'd want to know. Same thing on the non-IT side. I mean, are they actually measuring this, or are they just guessing, you know, when they put these things in? I think the other part of this is your publication times are going to be different. Some people publish 30 days. Some people publish longer. And so this sort of a display is going to give you some feel for those types of variations. But essentially, these are the steps. You should see the external benchmarking process slide. What we were trying to illustrate is you got to try to find comparable organizations and processes to look at. They say when you study this, you want to assemble a cross-functional team. You want to really study the processes. It's probably better than going to a overall aggregate like NIGP publishes to go to an organization like a similar one. I know one of our who is this? Melissa. Yeah, Melissa is with a airport, I think Fort Myers, right, Melissa? And you might want to go to, for example, a Tampa and figure out, you know, what they are achieving in terms of that, and then ask these kinds of questions in terms of performance. But these are the steps, and that when you study this, that often you'll see people or authors write about in terms of it. The one takeaway, and Ed and I have come on this, and it's funny how much similarity there was in our outlooks on this, but the other thing you've got to be able to know is whether or not you're under control, and that means, are you measuring things? I mean, you can't really compare to an external benchmark or metric if your processes really aren't under control and being measured. I mean, it's kind of a waste of time, I think some people will say. This Nancy Tague from the Quality Toolbox is one of the few resources I have here in the presentation, and in the book, actually, it's also there, that has some great guidance on various continuous improvement models, but they have a section on benchmarking. And this is one of the things that she suggests that you have to use. I'm curious, Ed, I know you had some thoughts on this, the importance of internal benchmarking.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Richard. You really have to do your internal homework and collect that data and figure out where you're at before you can go external. And personally, I'm a believer that your internal customers are those who you're trying to serve the most versus somebody on the outside. And the more you can understand your internal processes and the timing, the better you can communicate that to your internal customers. And the more they understand what the processes are and how long it takes, the better they'll understand how to fit their expectations within your guide, within your processes that you define. And then you can improve upon them. So in our group 2 or group 1, whichever it was, we talked about flow charting your processes and identifying how long it takes between steps. And then you take a look at it and see if there's any steps that don't add any value. Maybe they can be adjusted, modified, eliminated, moved to different parts of the process where they add more value. And then if you track those benchmarks year after year, and you see where you're at, and you can certainly tell, get a better idea of where you want to be and where you want to go, and it's a good tool.
And when I was at Colorado, I think that's what we used. I sort of took a run at external benchmarks, but it was more important to us to actually get a firm handle also on what we were doing, so we could see progress in the future. And great insight. I've got a slide here on other dangers and reasons for failures. We've identified one, and that is the processes often aren't the same. But if you're going to commit to this, you do have to have senior sponsorship and people that believe that this is worthwhile, because it is a big effort, especially when you're using cross-functional teams to look at benchmarks and dig into it. We've already talked about the control issue. Sometimes you're just guessing at how long it takes things to happen. The not invented here syndrome is a change management concept, which means there are going to be people that are skeptical about ever looking at somebody else's processes. It's something that causes external benchmark efforts to fail because it wasn't your idea, and there are going to be people that sometimes feel that way. It's really got to be part of it, and we're going to talk about this, part of a bigger strategy in terms of continuous improvement, not just looking at a single number and trying to get that one to work. And we'll see that here a little bit after in another 30 minutes or so. I think the next to the last bullet is important. When I've read people that are well versed in this, many of them say, it's really not about the metrics. It's about coming up with the process that leads to improved performance, looking at the process, which gets into the best practices that NIGP has. Is the page out of NIGP that has various developing evaluation criteria, ethical procurement, the evaluation process. So that's actually under the resources page in NIGP. They're practices. They're not numbers, but it's a way to take a look at the actual practices underlying some of these things. This is the what now is called the Quality Public Procurement Department Accreditation. And it has a series of 121 criteria. Is on the website, they don't just ask the question, they give you some context, the definition, and some examples, and a resource like a global best practice. So when I said early on, what's excellence, this is a great window into how you assess your organization's practices with respect to what your peers think are best practices. Ed was his organization achieved the Pareto Award, and I call that the penultimate award on procurement excellence. And I'll give you just a real brief on why this is. One of the things that an organization has to do in order to achieve it is they've got to get the NIGP OA4, the accreditation, which is now the QPPD. So that's the first step, or a step. And then once you do the application, there's a series of phases. One of the phases, I think it's phase 2, is an in-depth analysis in 4 areas about how you think you're doing. And there are leadership, strategic planning, customer focus, process management, performance review, that's the measurement piece, and the use of technology and information management. So you do that internally. Then there's a phase 3, and they bring in external people like auditors to visit, and essentially they're trying to validate that what you've said is really reflected in the practices, and they do interviews. And Ed led an organization that went through that. And there's only, I think there's 3 or 4 now that have the 5-year award of the Pareto. It really is, it's resource intensive, but boy, in terms of having somebody come in and look at you and validate what you're doing. I think it's terrific. So, when we first talked about your journey to the Pareto Award, I know that you'd gotten a challenge from your CEO. Tell us about that challenge.
Well, we got a new CEO and we were having some issues within procurement. I won't go into any details on that. We were a decentralized operation, and the CEO came, and one of his charges from his board was, you got to get this procurement thing fixed. The CEO is a marketing professional within the airport business industry, but he's not, it wasn't an operations frontline person. So he brought in NIGP Consulting, did a review and analysis, and they recommended we go centralized. He started on January 1, and on August 1st, we had a centralized procurement department by name, and with some folks in it. And his challenge to us was, he wanted us to stay out of the press, for us to spend the money properly as good stewards, and to be a model for the industry. And in private, one-on-one, he says, I want you to be the best procurement department in the universe. And so, and that's a big challenge. And then his next question was, how are you going to prove it to me that you are? And that led us to the whole concept of best practices in our research. We did a lot of research within the National Procurement Institute, NIGP, and the UPPCC, and Florida Association of Public Procurement Officials. I mentioned UPPCC because one of the recommendations from NIGP Consulting was that they recommended all of our procurement professionals be certified with either their buyer or their officials certification. And so each one of these things became our charging mantra.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. I'm just curious. I think did you achieve the 100% certification? I know that was a goal. Did you get there?
Oh yeah, as far as certification of
yeah.
Yes, we are currently at 100%. I believe Kathleen, she has all the scoop on that, the details.
Yeah.
We've slipped down to around 90%, but as people come and go, and but we maintain a very high percentage, and that brings a given quality of a basic basis of knowledge that individual has.
Yeah. The one thing I didn't know actually until this morning was, so Kathleen, so I can't really point because the Brady Bunch thing is in different places depending on your machine, I've learned. But Kathleen is from Tampa International Airport too, and I didn't realize you're on the accreditation committee too now, right? That's cool.
I am.
Yeah.
I am.
So did any of my description, how much of that was wrong and needed to be corrected? I'm just curious.
No,
So
you were fine.
that's pretty close. Okay. So some of this, so Ed and I, you all probably figure out, we talked about this a little in advance, and I told you I had never defined the term excellence. And it looks like you've got a pretty good definition of excellence between about 4 organizations, right? I mean, really, is that how you framed your idea of excellence?
Yeah, I think we defined our excellence as proving to the CEO that we are as good as anybody other procurement department based on these best practices, because they themselves are a benchmark. If you achieve each of these, and then Richard pointed out in one of his last slides the topic of continuous improvement. We don't stop right there. We develop we have a 5-year strategic plan within procurement, and every year we drop off a year and we add a year, and every one of those years has 4 or 5 items within these different accreditations and awards that we haven't achieved yet that we strive to achieve.
How did you decide what order to do the accreditations in? You had FAPO, NPI, NIGP and then Pareto. How did you basically make that decision?
Yeah, what we did was we took all of the accreditations and all of the criteria and we put them in one big spreadsheet. We listed all the criteria down on the left-hand side, and across the top we listed the different organizations such as the OA4, the Pareto, the FAPOAP, MPIAP, and so on and so forth. And we put a checkbox, an X, where they intersected, and you would there's a lot that overlap. So
Yeah.
FAPOAP requires a mission vision statement. So does the QA4, and so on and so forth. And we looked and we said, well, what boxes can we check off? Then we went and checked off all the boxes we can check off. And frankly, we looked at the one that we felt we were the closest to achieving. We built our 5-year business plan. We said, these are the things we need to achieve. And we built our business plan around that as one element. And so that's how we made our determination.
Cool. Yeah. This was a late question I asked you to get you to think about. What was the most important thing about the Pareto? And just again, to summarize for people, they actually show up and ask you questions about your application on Pareto, unlike the other accreditations. So I asked Ed to share with us what was the most the surprising thing that you think you learned when you did the Pareto.
I think the most surprising thing is we understood it was a big undertaking, but we didn't understand how big of an undertaking it was.
Yeah.
It was very comprehensive. You had mentioned that the 5 areas of or 6 areas that they focus on within Pareto, that where you have to do the self assessment, and there's 10 questions on each of those, and some of those questions you really have to think hard and deep and brainstorm, and you have to have the resources to accomplish that and to be committed towards it. But I would say that the biggest thing we've learned from the thing is the fact of having a business plan and having this spreadsheet and being able to periodically work on things when time is available, and if time's not available, it isn't there. So, but you haven't lost anything, and you got a good roadmap.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the last question I wondered is, you've achieved what your organization has, what I call the penultimate award in procurement excellence, the Pareto, but you're still working on it again. Why? What's your thinking on that? Why?
Well,
you've hit the mountaintop, right? So
yeah, but the mountaintop keeps moving. You know, these are public procurement isn't stagnant. You get organizations such as NIGP, as you can see, the vast learning possibilities that they're rolling out and different committees that they're forming, and they don't just say, okay, here's the 60 criteria for phase 2 for Pareto, and it's going to be that way forever. They have significantly changed the application process since we've gotten it last. And there's a lot of questions on there that we never really sat down and thoroughly looked at and done a soul search on to say, are we at that level in various regards? So that's the reason why we're going after Pareto again, because we want to be able to say there's new standards, and we meet those new standards as well as we did the old standards.
Yeah. Hey, good for you. Good for you, Ed. I wanted to thank, for this next slide here, I'm going to just put the share screen back up. Thank Kathleen for this. One of the things that is always out there is because there's kind of 2 competing, what I call kind of competing accreditations, although there's a lot of overlap on them. One is the National Procurement Institute Achievement of Excellence in Procurement. That's on the right-hand side here. And the other one is the what used to be the OA4, which is now the Quality of Public Procurement Department Award, the NIGP Award. And Kathleen was gracious enough, because I wondered how all of this kind of matched up against each other. And so we did a little, she did, and I truncated what she gave me a little bit, but these are some of the differences, just so you understand it. And I'll run through them, Kathleen, and then I'll let you correct my work on this. But the AAP is an annual one, and the QPPD, or the OA4 before that, was effective for 3 years. That's one of the differences. So you can see then from that there's a little bit of a financial difference. The QPPD has 121 questions, and you got to get 100 points. The AEP out of National Procurement Institute has 20 questions, and they have them grouped into weighted factors. And to be honest with you, it looked to me like, because I helped a school district with this once, it looked to me like it was a little easier to hit the amounts on the AEP the first time out than the NIGP accreditation, which I thought was a little more rigorous. The AEP has a section called continuous improvement. You get there on the QPPD with the types of questions they ask that frame the elements of continuous improvement. The AEP is a PDF document upload to show that you're complying or satisfying the questions that you answer. And QPPD, to their credit, has really gone to an online application now with links and kind of select uploads of documents to illustrate what you're doing. It's, I think, well, it's more electronically facilitated on a QPPD. It's been, I think, a great improvement. And AEP I used to say it was good because you could go in as a member and see representative or model responses. And the NIGP accreditation is doing that now. I showed you an example of that where they had some examples of what people were submitting in response. So it gives you not just questions that you have to say yes or no to, but also some ideas with it. So that's kind of the comparison. So correct my work, Kathleen, on that. So
You were spot on, Richard.
okay. So, I mean, I think, well, if you look at the numbers, sort of reflects that. I think AEP at 180 or something that they just published. There are some, and once you do that once, it's kind of easy to keep doing it again every year. I think the NIGP, for my notion, the NIGP is a little bit more rigorous and a little closer to what I would call a quality management program sort of response. But we thought we'd at least let you see that and see the comparison on that.
Hey, Richard.
Yeah.
One of the things for both of these awards or accreditations, whatever they're termed as, is, as you said, I'm going to use the AEP as an example. You need 100 points out of a possible 200. Yeah. If you just go get your 100 points or 110 points and year after year, you just basically regurgitate what you did previously and you still have the same amount of points, you're really not taking the full advantage of the program. It's intended to be continuous improvement, as you have on that third line. It's intended that you should strive to get higher points every single year. And it's a framework to help you achieve that.
Yeah, great insight, Ed. Yeah.
The OA4 or the QPPD is the same.
Yeah, same way. Yeah. Yeah. So we're going to move into systems thinking. Let's go on to the other end of the telescope. Okay, and call this avoiding unintended consequences. I'm going to give you a little example. We'll have a little breakout to finish up the learning lab and get you used to this kind of thinking. You know, this isn't really magic stuff, and you probably do this already, but I wanted you to see that there's a little science behind this whole idea and looking through the other end of the telescope periodically. But some people think that this is the way we think. We have a little linear movement from one proposition to another through inferences and we apply it, but you all know that this is the way we think, right? right? And that's our world. I mean, our world is much more complicated than linear thinking. And I often say one of my mantras is that teams, because I've written about teams, teams are the lifeblood of organizations, and procurement teams are part of the circulatory system, and it puts you into so much of what you're doing in an organization and interfacing with so many of your different sort of business operations and clients that it ends up looking this way. It ends up looking somewhat messy. And this is kind of systems thinking. If you are fortunate enough sometime, and I don't think any of you are graduates, because this came out of the Leaders Edge program that NIGP has. It started last year as a year. It's been kind of coronavirus truncated this, but the two people that are the consultants that run this terrific program, I found this in their in the Leaders Edge book. That as work gets more complex, a single individual doesn't have it all, and so you end up having to use in complex solutions really cross-disciplinary approaches, whether that's in your solicitations, writing contracts, even your business operations, and so this came out of the program workbook, and if you can get into that program, I think we're getting good feedback from it in terms of the things that people are learning in it. What's a complex system? My dad used to, could fix anything. And a lot of us have had mothers and fathers or relatives that just knew how to fix stuff. And he would drop out the engine of our old Volkswagen Beetle and rebuild it and put it back in his garage. And that was in the day when there were actually repair manuals for cars. Remember when that happened, Ed? There used to actually be repair manuals on cars. And I used to watch that and I realized, well, that's complicated. And there's a difference between things that are complicated and things like you do that are complex systems. Why? Because the complex system is sort of defined this way. There's a lot of differentiation between different elements of it. And there's a challenge with trying to put it all together in an integrated way because things are moving all the time. And the best example I have for this is probably what's happened in the last 40 years on sourcing. When I came in to federal procurement in the late 70s, we had never imagined anything like a procurement card, right? Mm-hmm. And now what do we have? Differentiated systems. We have catalog systems. We have sourcing systems like BidNet and whatever you have to do that. We're also now getting portions of those systems that allow receipt electronically of bids and proposals. We've got spend analysis systems now that are able to go in and integrate accounting data and procurement data to come up with different categories of expenditures. We have differentiated over the last 40 years what it means to do procurement, which is why you hear many people say it's not just a transaction anymore. It's complex. And the integration part of this is the difficulty in pulling all that together as a system. Why? Well, think about it. Yes, you can push out a procurement card and raise the amount of limits up to 10,000, but what do you lose in that? Well, one thing you may lose if you don't have a sophisticated procurement card vendor is the ability to actually do analysis of expenditures. You know who the vendors are, but you may not really know what the categories of expenditures are in a way that you can meaningfully use them. That's an integration issue that has made it a complex system. Same thing with bidding systems. And yes, you can go in and you can get the bid submitted electronically, but is it integrated with the differentiated system of the accounting system? Is it actually hooking together so you're not causing people more work in terms of what needs to be done? That's a complex system. You all work in complex systems. You probably work in one of the most complex systems that exist in government through procurement because you touch so many aspects of this. And that's why you start looking at the idea of other system impacts. I mean, how do all these things fit together? if you don't read anything else of anything that I've given you, and you're into this sort of thing, one of the better books, probably top 100 business in the last century, is by an author called Peter Senge, called The Fifth Discipline. And the fifth discipline is systems thinking. The other ones are the use of mental models, like we're talking about here, team learning, which is part of what you all do. Personal mastery, the ability to master specific tasks, and building a shared vision. We talked about on the first learning lab, the idea of having a shared purpose, like in a team or in an organization, or as Ed talks about, strategic planning for 5 years and getting people aligned. Those are the other disciplines, but the one we're focusing on here is this whole idea of system and system impacts. Peter Senge was famous for developing what he called archetypes in systems thinking. And this is one of the most fundamental ones. I thought I'd put it up and show you how it works. And we're going to use a procurement card. And you had a problem. I don't know what could be a problem. Maybe finance learned that somebody had just charged $8,000 to an event that had food and beverage for going away on the procurement card. I'm just curious, and you can give me a thumbs up. I see a little bit of smile in there. Is that a problem in some jurisdictions? Use of procurement card for food and beverages? Yeah. I see Kathleen saying, yeah. Well, that's a problem. So on the upper left-hand problem, you got a problem. And the immediate issue that you go to is you try to come up with a fix. Now, what can be a fix? I'm just curious. Unmute if anybody's got a shout out. What can be a fix to that kind of a problem? Somebody's abused a procurement card.
So we do allow for certain types of working meals and food and beverage for certain types of employee appreciation events. But then other than that, we perform regular compliance checks.
Okay, we call those post-transaction audits, right? So you're looking at things periodically after. Have you ever heard of pre-transaction audits?
No.
An example of that would be, I've got the card, nobody's going to let me use this unless you get the approval in advance for the purchase, and then you send it to me and I'll place the order. That would be a pre-transaction audit. That could be a fix. Yeah. Anybody else? I'm curious. Anybody else deal with procurement cards or have any kind of review systems in place?
My agency deals with procurement cards.
Yeah.
And so in this kind of circumstance, just like Kathleen said, there are occasions where it's okay, but like you were pointing out, there has to be a pre-transaction audit, and at our agency, what that looks like is a form, and it's got proper authorized signatures on it that says this person has been approved to proceed with this purchase.
Okay.
And so that has to accompany the P-card transaction, the receipts and the documentation. If the card was swiped and there wasn't any kind of authorization for that, then it's kind of more a reactive mode where we would then come back and say, this is a violation of your P-card. And, then you have to look at, is this what's the severity of the violation? Is this a first offense, second offense? Where are we at? And then handle it as appropriate given the circumstances.
Of course, could you not avoid all of that by having every P-card transaction require a previous authorization, right? You could do that.
Well, but then that kind of defeats the purpose of the P-card program.
Oh, okay. Uh-oh, now you're doing systems thinking, Melissa. No fair. Okay, so let's say that was proposed as a fix. And not only that, you decided not only are we going to do that, we're going to have the immediate supervisor approve it, and then we're going to send it up to Ed, and then we're going to send it up to the CEO. We're going to put in so many pre-transaction approvals to even permit the card to be used that it'll never happen again, basically. So we're up on that top part of this, and so the fix actually gets down over to the problem resolution, right? You fixed the problem, but what have you done? what may happen after a period of delay that you might not have intended? I'm just curious. Any thoughts?
Nobody gets to eat anymore.
Yeah, that, or, and this has happened to me before, it takes a little while before the complaining starts, but senior people start saying what? What do senior people start saying? In
It's a
terms of,
convoluted system. It's complicated.
and it's a resource hit, and
Mhm.
and some of them, if they're really honest, will say, I was the third level on the review. I'm not reading this stuff. I don't have time. I'm pencil whipping it. That was a military term we used to use. I'm pencil whipping it, and I'm just, it's a waste of my time. So in the delay, and this is the systems part, it usually takes a while before fixes actually show up, and then they impact by showing unintended consequences. And you can have mission impacts from this. I mean, people can spend so much time on the review process that they just don't have, time to get anything else done. And that complaining starts. Well, that is an example of the whole application of systems. So there's a word for what we just described. It's called sub-optimization. I mean, I've been around procurement card managers that were so proud of their system because it was like perfect. We had squeezed every bit of risk out of it, but what we were doing was ignoring other components of the mission in the organization, and other things were. It's tough for a leader to have that discussion, to say, there's an idea of acceptable risk. There's an idea of making sure that we're reaching reasonable assurance that it's not being abused, but we have to look at the entire system entirely. So now I'm going to stop now. Did I make anybody mad with anything I just said? Sub-optimization? How about you, Kathleen? I bet you're proud of your procurement card system. You got an idea now how to make it perfect, right?
No,
So,
no P card program is ever perfect.
well, actually, if you can get somebody to admit that, that's better than, and if you've got a leadership that recognizes that the whole idea of risk has to embody that sort of a little bit of an approach in terms of acceptable risk. I mean, that's getting a long ways. Ed, your thoughts on this, Ed? I'm just curious.
I'll tell you real quick, Rich.
Yeah.
I'll cut Ed off for a second. I'll tell you real quick that we are taking our P card procedure back through approval for revisions for like the 5th or 6th time this year. So it's constantly looking at it, tweaking it, making sure that the controls are there, but it's staying on track with the demands of the marketplace, and that it's providing the service to the organization it's intended to.
And I think you said that so well. And I don't know your program. I'm just going to guess, though, that you've got a cross-disciplinary group that's looking at this. It's not just you. Is it just you and your P card administrators, or are there other people that are sort of looking at this too?
We have a policy and procedures committee within the authority that has representatives from all the different departments. There's about
Cool.
22 of them. So they're able to socialize any edits to policies and procedures amongst the whole organization. Really try to poke holes in your logic for making changes before it becomes a permanent change, or not permanent, but before it goes official.
I mean, that's a great initiative. And that's what that's called a cross-disciplinary team. I mean, it may be senior and it may be an established policy group, but to look at these things, because it's awful easy for us. You've heard of groupthink, right? A groupthink, which is we all look at this for so long. We are the professionals, or procurement card professionals are involved in this. And sometimes you just don't see things like unintended impacts. The other thing is, there's a certain amount of risk management here too, and that is somebody in the organization has to make a decision, and it's usually a collective one, about how much we want to squeeze the risk out of processes like this. And that's probably not Kathleen's decision, right? Entirely. That's probably not just Ed's decision, maybe, or he socializes the idea enough so he knows thinking on it also. So I'm curious, Ed, any comments on this discussion about kind of hear what we've talked about?
Well, I would say that when we first inherited the P card program, when we went consolidated back in 2011, there were a lot of controls on the P card program. It was very convoluted. It was very restrictive. People didn't want to use their cards because of it. And I forget, what are the individual codes for the different types of commodities, Kathleen, that the merchants use?
MCC? MC, yeah.
They had MCC restrictions on this and on that and this and that and whatnot. We came in, we looked at it and we said, this is ridiculous. We removed every restriction on every MCC code. And we simply said, the card needs to be used to support the function of the aviation authority. And simply that, if it's not used for a business purpose, it shouldn't be used. And we pushed review and control to the supervisor.
Okay.
And the other thing is we built, and to Kathleen's credit, a very, very robust training program. Everybody has to be trained when you get a card. Everybody has to go through annual refresher training. We use technology and we push it out so it's online. So you can take these trainings at your own free will. And we have a good, as Melissa talked about, step process for discipline if it happens.
Okay.
But we tried to make it as simple and as broad as we possibly could for adaptability and acceptance by the users.
Okay, great. Well, you all, this is why you go to the stars. You learn thinking like this. So, I think that's terrific what you've done, and that's really systems thinking. I've given an example I'd like you to talk about out of real world stuff. There's a lot of discussions now about, we had trouble getting a hold of PPE, masks, ventilators, various types of things. We're hearing now a lot of people saying, why don't we just stockpile it and put it in inventory? So we don't have that problem anymore. But I think you'll find when you talk for a few minutes that there's a unintended consequence to that potentially that would have to be discussed in an entity. Group one thing that you identified maybe as a Maisie, as a possible unintended consequence. Anybody want to take a stab from group one? Yeah.
So one of the unintended consequences that we identified was having to manage all of that stockpiled PPE that is no longer in demand.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you've got a bunch of users that aren't used to even working with stockpiles, right? Because often you'll have a few, like the food services in a school district, they know how to do it all the time, or maintenance facilities do, but you've got other users. Great. Group two, I'm just curious. Another unintended consequence you might have had. Don't be shy.
One of the things that we brought up was usability of a product like hand sanitizer.
Yeah.
When we have products that don't meet the FDA standards, or they have an ingredient that it's toxic, like the methanol alcohol that's used in some of these off-brand hand sanitizers, and you have already purchased them. It's a disposable issue, and also it's a cost issue that you're just throwing that money away essentially.
Yeah. That's systems thinking. It's not like you don't do this all the time, right? But sometimes it requires insight, like a warehouse manager from somebody outside your particular area, to say, well, have we thought about how are we going to do the distribution out of the, out of the warehouse, or out of the Rubik's Cube, if that's what Ed had, or, the rest of that, because there's a lot of people that need PPE that they've never been in a warehouse. They have no idea what to do. I mean, so the planning, and I think you identified it in group one, there'd be a lot of resource hits to that. So how to do it. So that's the other end of the telescope. And that's why I introduced that a little bit in chapter 3 of the book. You can think through the other end of the telescope. Thanks everybody for your participation, and Ed, thank you for the contributions that you've made to the profession and to this. Kathleen, for your help. I think we all learn from you. So thanks everybody.